flat hunting process for us went on for around 2 months and was easily one of the most stressful experiences I've ever been through. It's a unique kind of stress that is almost impossible to switch off from. For the best part of 2 months, I found it incredibly difficult to focus on anything else and became very distracted from studying, work, and socializing. The university wasn't particularly helpful, only offering us temporary accommodation at Paula calls. They also offered little to no moral support or check-ins, but this is not surprising when compared to my general experience at Edinburgh. Although this housing crisis is nationwide, there is a sense that Edinburgh University have made the situation worse by offering more places to students than they can accommodate for. The Scottish Government is also focusing on measures to help current tenants, such as rent freezes, but with little focus on those struggling to find housing, which also doesn't help.
Could you please introduce yourself, your role, and what that role entails?
Okay. Thanks very much for having me. So I'm Pauline Flannery, and I'm Councillor Pauline Flannery for Southside Newington. And on the council, that's the City of Edinburgh Council, I'm on the Housing, Homeless and Fair Work Committee.
The housing situation in Edinburgh has been quite the tumultuous time for students recently. I was wondering, what do you think are the main causes for this issue?
Thank you. I think it's a perennial problem that we've got, and if I can talk about Southside Newington, it's a perfect storm. I know we've been hearing that phrase a lot recently, but it really is. So you've got a reduced housing stock, number one. You have an increase in short-term lets. You have also an intensification of student housing purpose-built, which is, I think, outside of most students' pockets. And I think put those three things together, trying to find accessible housing for students has become a real issue.
Talking about, more university involvement with the student community, I was wondering, are there any steps that you're taking personally or with your party, with in terms of Southside Newington constituency, that is looking to combat this housing crisis?
Thank you. Well, certainly as a member of the Housing and Homeless and Fair Work, I would love to see, and I have to say it's an aspiration, but I would love to see the student body as a named group. They're not visible at all on the council radar. I myself am a part-time student at Queen Margaret's, so I'm very much aware, I think, of both the personal toll, the need, and how you can't really think straight. If you don't have a roof over your head, then studies, etc., really are a second issue. So I think to make them a visible group within the council, I think is really, really important. To advocate on their behalf, most definitely so. To build that bridge between all of our communities, that's for me, that's a long-term aspiration, again, over my 5-year period. Because I think there is a bit of a disconnect between the local community and students.
What is the current housing policy, or perhaps a new policy that you're going to implement to help students in this time?
Well, in terms of what we're going to try and do, I think that's, again, it's the aspiration. I think it's most definitely push for mixed housing and mixed tenureship, definitely push for affordability and accessibility, make sure that they are a group that are identified. At the moment they're very hidden. I know that that's largely to do with age. It's a tricky thing here, and also perhaps an assumption that the universities themselves in actual fact look after and making sure that there's a bit more joined up thinking, I think, there. And I think the other thing is making sure that they would be eligible for mid-market rents.
I was wondering, are you working with other parties as well to help improve the situation in Edinburgh? And if so, is the policy similar, or are there other aspects that they're bringing in as well to help bolster the policy going forward?
Lovely question. And I suppose I'm going to give a politician's answer here. So on the housing, homeless and fair work, obviously it's represented by all parties. So that's the first thing. And we do work, I think, largely in a sort of collegiate manner, because housing is one of the most basic things, really, that you could be really looking out for, making decisions about. We are all committed, as far as I'm aware, but I think we're all committed to the 2030 plan, and that is about providing, not sure we'll get there, but that is about providing 20,000 new affordable homes. So it's a big ask. We're not going to make it, I don't think.
And just speaking about that plan that you have for 2030, I'm going to bring it a lot more short term. And I was wondering, what differences do you think that we'll be able to see in the next year, or so, maybe 2 years, 3 years, that just shows a different picture of the Edinburgh now compared to Edinburgh that hopefully will be?
Again, good question. And I think certainly the big thing that's going to be affected is the registration of the short-term lets, and therefore the increase in multiple occupancy. So I would like to think, ever the optimist, that would mean that there would be more housing, and particularly more housing for students. I think there is a great move within universities, particularly on students' mental health. So I think there is definitely, again, a will to get involved at all levels and all stages of a student's time at university. And I think that's not before time. I think, speaking as a mother, I remember sort of leaving my son and that was it. And then thinking about, what's going to happen? Who's going to look after him? And actually being told, so he's in his 7th year now of studies, so not that long ago, that, we will not contact you if anything goes wrong. They're adults. And I remember feeling very, very bereft for the first time and actually out of control.
Thank you very much. We're just coming to the end of our interview. I've just got one more question. It's very open, very broad. Just any more thoughts or opinions that you'd like to share about the situation, about things that we could do better, or literally whatever you'd like to say?
Thank you. I think really just building on what I've just said is that from a council point of view, students are as much part of the city of Edinburgh as every other community, and I would like students to just really think that, believe in that, trust it, use it.
Hi, I'm Susu, and I'm joined with Professor Harmon. If you'd just like to introduce yourself and what you do as your role as Vice President of Students.
Sure. Thank you. Hi, I'm Colm Harmon. I'm Vice Principal Students, and I'm also a Professor of Economics. And my role, in effect, covers student issues from prospective students thinking of joining the university through to when our students become alumni, and everything that happens along that journey.
And I was just wondering, I'm sure you know about the housing crisis. I was just wondering what your opinions on it and thoughts, and how have you seen it affect students coming into Edinburgh?
Well, the housing issue for us has been it's interesting. From our point of view, we start the planning conversations around housing very early, and all of the issues around our accommodation availability are intrinsically linked to our conversations around recruitment of students. So I feel pretty comfortable that for the students that we've always traditionally supported, we do a very careful piece of work to make sure that we can happily meet that. And we don't have the problems that we saw other universities having to sort of send students away to other towns and bus them in every day. But I think there's a much bigger question coming to us around life in Edinburgh and what student life looks like, and how do we have that conversation with the student body, not necessarily about the guaranteed places group, who I think we can take care of, but the wider student body, and it's how that's going to impact on them.
Yeah. Thank you. So you believe that ensuring students a place to live during their studies is a priority for the university and something that they should be doing?
So it's impossible for us to provide a place for every student. What isn't impossible for us to do is, as a university in partnership with the student associations and with student bodies more broadly, is to continue to have the conversation with the city council, with all the other housing and other agencies around making sure that the student needs are part of the planning process for the city as a whole. We want to provide more accommodation. We've opened new accommodation, particularly for postgraduate students, for example, and help different styles of accommodation. We want to have more price points, but for example, we've had planning permissions turned down repeatedly. So we are making every effort. We could never provide accommodation for every student, but we can continue to lobby and do lobby continuously to for the voice of students to be heard in those debates. But that's a tough gig for us.
You must have a duty of care for your students. I was just wondering, you touched on earlier, it was mainly for the guaranteed students. Is there any maybe policy going forward or any implementation for maybe non-guaranteed students as well for that duty of care and responsibility, just so it can have a wider audience as well?
I mean, the accommodation strategy more broadly, does need revising, and I think there's several dimensions to that. There's one is the guarantee, and as I said, I'm comfortable we're in a good place on the guarantee. I think the second is continuously ensuring that we have more capacity beyond that, and recognizing that for increasing numbers of students, the traditional model of being in halls for the first year and then never seeing them again may change, and they may see our halls as desirable. In many ways, our halls are more secure. They're cheaper than the private market, for example. So we want to make sure that we can, to use that language, maximise what our estate can provide in student. Idealised vision we have of being in Edinburgh, walking across the meadows and living in Marchmont and all those kind of things, that's probably a reality that we're going to have to confront as changing.
Many students have been sofa surfing throughout the first few months of the semester. I was just wondering, could you really say that you're improving the student experience if many of them are still homeless and have been left homeless throughout the start of the semester?
Well, no, I mean, I don't want that. I don't see students couch surfing. It's not good for them, and it's not good for their studies. It's not good for their health and well-being. Is it a good student experience? No, it obviously isn't. How much of it we can, to be perfectly honest, how much we can as an institution control and deliver on is tricky, because as I said, we can't provide the accommodation at will. To the basic question, do I consider it a good student experience? No.
Our private letting agencies now are expecting a lot more students to keep their current flats and housing. And I was just wondering, what support are you hoping to give out to either students returning from their year abroad or students moving out of halls or moving flats? What support are you going to be giving them that haven't got a flat confirmed for their next years of studies? What's going to be what's in place for them?
So what's in place right now, I think, is relatively little. That's been the story very much of the last 2, 3, 4 years in general. There's so many things that we never thought we'd have to think about that we now have to think about. We've changed our kind of mental health and well-being support structure, for example, to react to a completely changed landscape around that issue. I think the issues around student housing are probably not the next cab off the block, really. And for me, the sort of things you're asking, we don't have clear plans on right now, but could we have? Yes. And I think what the message from me would be, tell us the sort of things that you think is going to be useful.
How are you thinking of spreading the word and communicating the new initiatives that you and the student leadership team will be taking? How do you think is the best way to get that out, get that message out? As a lot of students, I think, have felt quite a distance from you and them. There hasn't been much communication. So with these new initiatives and plan to help them secure housing, how are you going to rectify that gap between them?
Well, thanks. That's a really important question for me. And I'm sorry to answer a question with a question, which is always a way of politicians deflecting things. But I guess it's really interesting for me to hear and that you feel students feel that you don't hear enough from me. I mean, I certainly am more than happy to be communicating more broadly, and certainly at times over the last 2 or 3 years that I've been here, we've pushed communications out from my office or from me personally more than we might have done in the past. I think that the balancing act for me always is between is a sense of when are we saying communicating too much or too little, and how is the message reaching, and secondly making sure particularly around lots of issues that are current. For example, to look at the example of around housing, if students couldn't arrive, for example, by the time, or didn't have housing, what were the options? Those options have to be managed at the level of a school. So my communicating on some of those things runs the risk of confusing matters, frankly, when I don't have the sort of jurisdiction to say, it's okay to arrive late if you're a philosophy student, but it's not okay to arrive late if you're a physics student. I don't have that sense of what's acceptable and what's not. I think the cost of living and the available hardship funds, for example, are being accessed, but I'm worried that the process is not clear enough, and that there isn't a clear understanding with students that this money is there. There's a team within the university that deal with it and can get money to you very quickly if there's a crisis.
Just one last question. Any parting thoughts or opinions you'd like to share? Where can students get in touch with you? Who can they go talk to about these kind of things and to get support?
Sure. I mean, I think there's several. So one, I'm colm.harman@ed.ac.uk. Many students email me every day about things. It's one of the joys of the job, and I don't say that to make it sound frilly or fancy. It really is why I do this job. Lucy is Lucy Evans at ed.ac.uk as Deputy Secretary. Many of the things that we do, she drives. Both of us are more than happy, to be contacted directly. I think we want to try and make sure that we try and use the web and other forms of communications more effectively. So if you're not looking at those parts of the website, they are actually updated very frequently. They're not as glossy sometimes as I think they might be, but that's a design question more than anything else. I think there's a lot of information around cost of living funds, accessing it, and so on, that is there. Look at those sources. But critically is when things are going wrong, or if things are starting to look like they're going wrong, tell us. We need to know. It sounds very kind of cheesy, but we're sort of in this together about these things. Our job is to try and make it as right as possible. We can't solve all the problems, and I think it's my job to be as honest when I can't solve something as much as when I can. But I would say, look at that website. It does change frequently. Email me or email Lucy if easier. We get it all the time, and we welcome it. And that's actually true, I think, for the senior team more broadly. The number of emails the principal gets, which he answers, is significant. But it's better for us to start to get things when they're emerging, and we also love getting ideas. As I said, if someone has something we says, well, if this was in place, this would help. We then can go, you're right, that might help. Let's see, can we experiment with something? So reach out to me, reach out to Lucy, check the web, watch the social media, all the kind of obvious things. But let us know when things are going wrong, and let us know your ideas about how things could be better.
Vice President of Community at USA. We've spoken to a lot of students who have been sofa surfing and even in temporary accommodation at the university. There's even been some that have been forced into Airbnbs and youth hostels for the lack of a permanent address. They felt almost forgotten by the university. How are we making sure that someone checks up on these students?
Okay, so one of the big problems with the university is that they don't collect data on how many students are homeless at any one time. So they know that there are students sofa surfing, they know that there are students staying in Airbnbs and hostels, but they don't know how many of them there are, and that's a really big issue. So one of the things that we've been lobbying for is for them to start collecting data and to do actual outreach to make sure that students who are facing homelessness, who are in temporary accommodation, are being cared for.
How are you ensuring that students are housed?
So there's kind of two areas that I work in. The first is lobbying the government for change. So myself and Lauren have been meeting with MPs and MSPs in September and October. We've met with various MPs and MSPs to talk about cost of living crisis, but also the housing crisis. Part of that work was writing a letter to Jamie Hepburn, the Minister for Higher and Further Education, where I outlined some of the support the government could be doing. Part of that is increased financial support for commuter students. So that makes sure that any students that have been priced out of Edinburgh can afford to get to the university to complete their studies. The second is increase in hardship funding, which makes sure that students who can't afford rent, who can't afford to eat, who can't afford to heat their homes are getting money to do that. And the third area is increased support in housing issues. So, for instance, putting rent caps on past the rent freeze that will end next spring. And then the second area that I work in is lobbying the university. So like I said, that's meeting with university leadership team. We have found that close to 1 in 5 students in Edinburgh are paying over £800 a month for accommodation.
So what about this year? What about for the students that are coming in semester 2? What is being done to make sure that they don't have the same experience that students this semester have had?
So that was kind of one of my big things in September, was making sure that even though a lot of students were homeless, there could be like immediate action, and we did demand immediate action. One of the points that we made was that they have to get more of a strategy in place for January and next September to make sure that this doesn't happen again. Unfortunately, the university doesn't seem to have a strategy in place for January, which means that we are looking at this happening all over again. We demanded many things at the beginning of this year. One of those is for them to use their hotel like they did last year to house homeless students. They refused to do that. Another thing was to put out clear and concise communications to students about what they should be doing if they can't be in Edinburgh. They didn't do that. So from our point of view, they are not doing enough to tackle the housing crisis. In actual fact, I don't feel like they've done much other than offer some students place in halls. They also made a surplus of £60 million last year, and yet there seems to be no better financial aid other than that £1 million into the hardship pot. So they could be doing more to financially support students, to help students pay for their rent in Edinburgh.
So what practical steps do you think the university could be taking to lessen, the blow?
As I said, there's many hotels that the university owns. They refused to clear those hotels and put students in those spare beds. So that meant that students were left living in bunk beds, in dormitories, in Pollock halls. They have so much money that they could be using to help house students. They could even be paying for people to be in hotel rooms. They also said to us that one of the things that they didn't want to do last year was to overbuy student accommodation and have spare beds, which meant that students were left without homes this year, without places to live, without support. And so we think that maybe having a few spare beds here and there, which they could easily turn into accommodation for other people to use, is way better than allowing students to be plunged into homelessness.
Do you think the increase in students on campus have in fact affected the lack of housing?
Definitely, I think it has. So we know that over the past 5 or 6 years, the university has grown by over 9,000 students, so going up from 41,000 to almost 50,000, and there just isn't the resource to deal with this. It not only affects housing, but sort of everything, including staff, well-being, and all kinds of resources. We at the Students' Association have to deal with it as well. But yeah, they are doing nothing to slow down this track of just gaining more and more and more students. And part of that seems to be that they want to make more money, but they are making, last year they made a £60 million surplus. They don't need more money. And to some extent, they should be thinking about the resources in the city to deal with the amount of students that are coming in.